In 1281 AD, the mighty Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, having conquered the Song Empire and subjugated Korea, launched the greatest amphibious invasion in history up to that point, assembling a vast armada of over 900 warships and support vessels, carrying an army of 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops, equipped with advanced composite bows, ironclad cavalry, gunpowder grenades, and siege engines, all aimed at finally bringing the defiant island nation of Japan to heel after the failed attempt in 1274. While on the shores of Kyushu, particularly Hakata Bay, a determined force of roughly 1,000 elite samurai from clans like the Shoni, Otomo, and Matsura, reinforced by local warriors and supported by the Hojo Regency's mobilization, fortified the beaches with low stone walls, prepared small, swift boats for boarding actions, and stood ready with their legendary katanas, naginata polearms, and powerful yumi longbows to meet the invaders in a fight that would determine whether Japan would preserve its independence or fall under the Mongol yoke like so many others before it. The first invasion, in 1274, had seen a smaller Mongol fleet of around 30,000 repulsed after initial landings when a sudden storm scattered their ships, but the samurai had already proven their worth in ferocious close-quarters fighting aboard enemy vessels, boarding with ropes and hooks to turn the decks into slaughterhouses, where their superior individual swordsmanship overwhelmed the invaders' massed archery and phalanx tactics. And now, in 1281, the Japanese were better prepared, having spent 7 years building defenses and training, while the Mongols, overconfident from continental conquests, divided their fleet into two arms, one from Korea and one from southern China, planning a pincer movement that arrived separately and gave the defenders time to concentrate. As the Eastern fleet from Korea arrived first in June, landing thousands at Hakata, the samurai charged into the shallows without hesitation, wading through surf to meet the disembarking troops, their heavy lacquered armor and helmets with menacing face masks, contrasting the lighter scale and lamellar of the invaders. And in the brutal melee that followed, the Japanese warriors fought with such ferocity and skill that Mongol commanders reported their men could not stand against them in hand-to-hand combat, the katana's razor edge slicing through armor, while naginata swept cavalry from saddles, and arrows from yumi outranged the shorter Mongol bows in the humid conditions, forcing the invaders back to their ships with heavy losses day after day. The Southern Fleet arrived in August, swelling the invasion force to its full 40,000, and the Mongols launched coordinated assaults with bomb-throwing catapults hurling explosive pottery grenades that terrified and wounded the Japanese ranks, while massed archery and shielded spear walls pushed forward, overwhelming some sections of the stone wall and establishing beachheads where they began constructing fortifications. Yet the samurai refused to break, launching night raids with fire arrows and boarding parties that set ships ablaze, capturing supplies and sowing panic among conscript troops far from home, while heroic figures like Takezaki Suenaga led daring charges that cut deep into enemy lines, his personal exploits recorded in illustrated scrolls showing him dueling Mongol champions amid chaos. As the standoff dragged into late summer, the Mongol fleet remained anchored offshore, vulnerable to weather, supplies dwindling and disease spreading in the crowded ships, while Japanese morale soared with every repulsed assault and successful raid, the defenders' smaller numbers becoming an advantage in the confined landing zones where Mongol numerical superiority could not be fully brought to bear, and priests at shrines across Japan prayed for divine intervention as the invaders prepared a final push. Then, on August 15th, a massive typhoon of unprecedented violence struck the bay, winds howling like demons and waves towering like mountains as the poorly anchored fleet was torn apart, hundreds of ships smashed against rocks or sunk with all hands, tens of thousands drowning in the churning sea, while the samurai on shore watched in awe as wreckage washed up with survivors who were swiftly cut down or captured. The divine wind, Kamikaze, finally abated, the beaches were strewn with debris and bodies, the once mighty armada reduced to flotsam, and Japan stood saved not only by the unyielding courage of 1,000 samurai who had held the line against impossible odds for weeks, but by the intervention of heaven itself, ensuring the nation's independence and allowing its unique culture to develop without foreign domination for another 6 centuries. The failed invasions drained the Yuan treasury, weakened Kublai's prestige, and contributed to the dynasty's eventual decline, while in Japan, the victory reinforced faith in the gods' protection, elevated the samurai class to unchallenged power under the Kamakura shogunate, and birthed the legend of Kamikaze that would echo through history even into the 20th century. Consider how those 1,000 samurai, standing resolute on the bloodied shores with blades drawn against the greatest empire the world had known, did not merely crush 40,000 invaders through unmatched martial skill, relentless raids, and unbreakable spirit, but with the aid of the divine wind, preserved an entire civilization's freedom, forging an eternal legend of defiance that proves determined warriors defending their homeland can turn back any conquest when courage and fate align against tyranny. The aftermath of the divine wind that crushed the Mongol invasion in 1281 reverberated across Asia like thunder across the sea. For Kublai Khan, already aged and burdened by the immense cost of building and supplying the vast armada that now lay shattered at the bottom of Hakata Bay, suffered a blow to his prestige from which the Yuan dynasty never fully recovered, his generals returning with tales of invincible Japanese warriors and storms sent by angry gods, discouraging further attempts at overseas conquest, while the treasury bled from the loss of thousands of ships, horses, weapons, and men that could have been used to consolidate power in China itself, hastening internal rebellions and the dynasty's eventual fall less than a century later. In Japan, the victory elevated the warrior class to unprecedented heights, the Kamakura shogunate under the Hojo regents gaining legitimacy as protectors chosen by heaven, rewarding loyal samurai with lands and titles that solidified their dominance over court nobles, while shrines like Ise and Hakuzaki received lavish donations in thanks for the divine intervention, priests proclaiming the emperor and nation under eternal protection from foreign barbarians, a belief that shaped Japanese worldview for generations and reinforced isolationist tendencies when later Europeans arrived. The legend of the Kamikaze grew with each retelling. Illustrated scrolls like the Moko Shurai Ekotoba depicting Takezaki Suenaga and other heroes charging into battle with flowing banners and grim determination. Their individual exploits celebrated an art that emphasized personal valor over massed formations, preserving the memory of how small bands of warriors turned back overwhelming fleets through skill, courage, and night raids that kept the invaders off balance for weeks. The failed invasions also marked the high point of Mongol expansion, Kublai's dreams of conquering Java and Vietnam similarly faltering in the years that followed, his empire overstretched and vulnerable to the very forces that would topple it, while Japan entered a period of relative peace under samurai rule that allowed arts like Zen Buddhism, tea ceremony, No theater, and garden design to flourish without foreign interference, creating the classical culture that would define the nation until the Meiji Restoration. The storms of 1274 and 1281 became woven into national mythology as proof of Japan's divine favor. The term kamikaze later revived in the 20th century during World War II when pilots embraced the same spirit of sacrificial defense, though the original divine winds were natural typhoons that struck at the perfect moment after human effort had weakened the enemy enough to make destruction total. Archaeological evidence from Hakata Bay still washes ashore, rusted Mongol bombs, arrowheads, ship timbers, and ceramic grenades, testifying to the scale of the catastrophe, while stone walls built by the Japanese in 1276 stand as monuments to their preparation, low but effective barriers that channeled attackers into killing zones where samurai could strike and withdraw. The invasions united fractious clans under the shogunate's banner as nothing else could, postponing civil war for decades and allowing the military government to consolidate power, while the absence of Mongol occupation meant Japan avoided the cultural assimilation that befell Korea and China, preserving Shinto and Buddhist traditions in their pure forms and developing a unique warrior ethic that prized loyalty, honor, and readiness to die over mere survival. Travelers to modern Hakata can visit the Genko Historical Museum, displaying artifacts from the wrecks, stand on the beaches where samurai once fought in the surf, and see reconstructed sections of the defensive wall that held just long enough for the storm to arrive, while festivals commemorate the victory with parades of warriors in reproduction armor carrying banners from the era. The story has inspired countless books, films, anime, and games depicting the dramatic boarding actions, arrow duels, and apocalyptic typhoon that swallowed the fleet, keeping the legend alive for new generations who see in it the ultimate proof of homeland defense against overwhelming odds. Consider how those 1,000 samurai who stood on the shores of Hakata Bay in 1281, their armor gleaming under stormy skies as they charged into the waves against 40,000 invaders from the greatest empire on earth, did not merely crush the conquest through unmatched martial prowess, relentless harassment, and unyielding spirit that bled the enemy for weeks, but, when joined by the divine wind that scattered the armada like leaves in autumn, preserved Japan's sovereignty for centuries, forged the soul of a nation built on Bushido and divine protection, and demonstrated to history that even the mightiest conquerors can be humbled when brave defenders stand united with fate itself against tyranny. A legacy that burns eternal in the heart of every story of courage against impossible odds. The enduring impact of the samurai's stand against the Mongol invasions extended far beyond the immediate salvation of Japan in 1281, for the divine winds that crushed Kublai Khan's armada not only preserved the nation's sovereignty, but fundamentally shaped its political, cultural, and spiritual identity for centuries to come, as the Kamakura shogunate, already the de facto rulers through their military prowess, gained unassailable legitimacy as the divinely favored protectors of the realm, their regents from the Hojo clan distributing rewards to loyal vassals that strengthened the feudal system of lord and retainer, while the imperial court in Kyoto, though symbolically revered, retreated further into ceremonial irrelevance, the emperor's divine status reinforced by the storms seen as heavenly intervention on behalf of the land of the gods. This victory fostered a profound sense of Japanese exceptionalism, the belief that the islands were protected by kami who would repel any foreign invader, a conviction that discouraged overseas adventures and encouraged inward focus, allowing arts, literature, and philosophy to develop in isolation from continental influences, producing masterpieces like the Tale of the Heike, with its meditations on impermanence, inspired in part by the transient glory of warriors who would face the Mongols, while Zen Buddhism flourished among the samurai class as a discipline of mind and spirit suited to men who lived by the sword, its emphasis on direct insight and readiness for death mirroring Bushido's emerging code of honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. The failed invasions also left tangible scars on the Mongol Empire, Kublai's resources so depleted by the loss of two massive fleets that he abandoned further maritime ambitions, his planned conquests of Java and Vietnam meeting similar failure and accelerating the Yuan dynasty's overextension, internal strife, and eventual collapse in 1368, when native Chinese rebellions overthrew Mongol rule, the Japanese resistance thus indirectly contributing to the restoration of Han Chinese power under the Ming. In Japan, the absence of foreign occupation meant no imposition of Mongol administrative systems or cultural assimilation as in Korea, allowing Shinto shrines to thrive with increased patronage, festivals commemorating the Kamikaze to become annual events with processions of warriors in reproduction armor carrying sacred relics, while poets and artists romanticized the storms as manifestations of the thunder god Raijin or the dragon king Ryujin rising to defend the realm. Archaeological dives in Hakata Bay continue to yield treasures from the wrecks, porcelain from China, iron bombs with fused powder, horse fittings from the steppes, and even personal items like combs and dice carried by soldiers who never returned home, each artifact a silent witness to the scale of destruction wrought by the typhoon after weeks of human resistance had worn the invaders down. The defensive stone walls, though modest in height, proved brilliantly effective in funneling attackers into narrow zones where samurai could strike with concentrated force, their design studied by later generations as a model of coastal defense that influenced fortifications during the Sengoku period, and even the castle-building boom under Hideyoshi and Ieyasu. The invasions unified the warrior class as never before, fractious daimyo setting aside rivalries to answer the shogunate's call, a temporary solidarity that delayed but did not prevent the civil wars that would come when rewards for service grew insufficient. Yet the memory of collective defense against a common enemy remained a powerful ideal invoked in later conflicts. The legends spread beyond Japan through Marco Polo's accounts and Chinese records that portrayed the storms as supernatural, enhancing the mystique of the island kingdom in European imagination long before direct contact, while in Korea, the forced participation in the invasions bred lasting resentment toward both Mongols and Japanese. Modern Japan honors the events at sites like the Genko Museum in Fukuoka, with detailed dioramas of boarding actions and storm-lashed ships. Schoolchildren learning the story is foundational to national identity, while the term kamikaze took on tragic new meaning in 1944-45 when pilots embraced the ancient spirit in desperate defense, though the original divine winds were celebrated as salvation rather than sacrifice. Films like Mongol invasion scrolls brought to life in animation, video games recreating samurai boarding Mongol junks with katana flashing, and novels exploring the human drama of warriors like Suinaga, whose illustrated memoirs survive as priceless records of individual heroism amid massed war, all keep the flame alive for contemporary audiences fascinated by the clash of continental empire against island warriors. Consider how those 1,000 samurai who held Hakata Bay against 40,000 invaders from the world's greatest empire, fighting with such ferocity in surf and smoke that they bled the enemy for weeks until the heavens themselves unleashed the divine wind to complete the destruction, did not merely crush the conquest, but forge the unbreakable spirit of a nation that would remain unconquered by foreigners for over 600 years, preserved its unique culture through isolation born of confidence, and left a legacy of courage and divine favor that continues to inspire every tale of defiance where outnumbered defenders stand against overwhelming might, proving eternally that when warriors of unyielding will guard their homeland with blade and bow, even the gods will rise to ensure that freedom endures against the darkest storms of tyranny.
The cultural and psychological imprint of the samurai victory over the Mongol invasions in 1281 penetrated every layer of Japanese society for generations, embedding a narrative of divine election and martial superiority that influenced everything from governance to art to foreign policy, as the shogunate's successful mobilization against the greatest threat in memory justified their usurpation of real power from the imperial court, the Hojo regents portraying themselves as indispensable guardians whose military administration had earned heaven's favor, while emperors and nobles, though still venerated as descendants of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, accepted their reduced role in a dual system where spiritual authority resided in Kyoto and actual rule in Kamakura, a balance that endured until the 14th century when discontent over insufficient rewards for invasion service sparked the unrest that toppled the Hojo and brought Emperor Go-Daigo's brief Kenmu restoration before Ashikaga Takayuji established the Muromachi shogunate. This victory reinforced Japan's insularity, successive shoguns restricting foreign contact to controlled trade with China and Korea through designated ports, wary of any power that might repeat the Mongol attempt, a policy that evolved into the Sakoku closed country edict of the Tokugawa era centuries later, preserving Japanese culture from external domination, but also limiting technological exchange until the 19th century. The kamikaze legend permeated literature and theater, no plays dramatizing ghostly warriors returning to recount their defense, kabuki spectacles recreating boarding actions with elaborate stage effects for storms, and military tales like the Taiheki chronicling the era's heroism alongside its tragedies, all reinforcing Bushido ideals of absolute loyalty even unto death that matured in the relatively peaceful centuries following the invasions. Zen monasteries flourished as samurai sought mental discipline to face mortality, masters teaching that life and death are illusions and the warrior must act without hesitation, a philosophy perfectly suited to men who had seen comrades cut down in the surf, yet charge again without fear, while Shinto shrines multiplied offerings of captured Mongol weapons and armor as thanks to the kami who had summoned the winds. The invasion's failure also altered power dynamics in East Asia, Korea bearing the brunt of Mongol retribution for the fleet's loss and remaining under heavier tribute for decades, while Vietnam's Tron dynasty drew inspiration from Japan's resistance to repel 3 Mongol invasions of their own in the same era, adopting similar guerrilla and scorched earth tactics that exhausted the invaders. Archaeological discoveries continue to enrich the story, divers recovering intact Mongol bombs with characters identifying their Yuan arsenals, anchors weighing tons, and even sealed jars of gunpowder that failed to explode, while onshore excavations uncover layers of arrowheads from both sides, fused in the sand where samurai and invaders clashed knee-deep in water. Modern commemorations at Hakata include annual festivals with torch-lit processions along the defensive walls, children dressed as miniature samurai parading with wooden katanas, and solemn ceremonies at seaside shrines casting lanterns into the bay for drowned souls on both sides, acknowledging the human tragedy beneath the triumph. The story has crossed into global popular culture through films depicting the storm as a roaring dragon of wind and wave, anime series exploring fictional warriors who fought in the invasions, and video games allowing players to command samurai raids or Mongol landings with historical accuracy in armor and tactics. Military historians study the campaigns as classic examples of amphibious warfare failure, noting how Japanese small boat tactics prefigured later guerrilla naval strategies, and how anchoring a large fleet in typhoon season without proper harbors doomed the enterprise despite superior technology. The Kamikaze name's 20th century appropriation during World War II added layers of complexity to the legacy, pilots viewing themselves as modern divine winds, sacrificing for the nation, though historians emphasize the original storms were celebrated as preservation rather than destruction. Tourism to Kyushu thrives on the history, visitors walking reconstructed walls, viewing museum dioramas of ships floundering in giant waves, and standing on cliffs imagining samurai silhouettes against the horizon where once 400 sails approached. Consider how those 1,000 samurai who met 40,000 invaders on the blood-soaked shores of Hakata Bay in 1281, fighting with such transcendent skill and unbreakable resolve that they held the greatest army on earth at bay for weeks until the divine wind rose to complete the annihilation, did not merely crush a conquest that would have reshaped East Asia, but safeguarded a civilization's soul for 7 centuries, nurtured the flowering of arts and philosophy in peaceful isolation, inspired countless generations with proof of heaven's favor for the righteous defense of home, and etched into human memory the eternal truth that when warriors of pure spirit stand together against any darkness, even the elements themselves will align to ensure that freedom prevails and tyranny is swept into the sea. A legacy as vast and enduring as the oceans that both brought the invaders and bore them to their doom.
The profound transformation wrought by the samurai's defiance of the Mongol invasions in 1281 extended into every facet of Japanese life and beyond, creating ripples that shaped not only the nation's internal evolution, but its interactions with the wider world for hundreds of years, as the divine wind's destruction of Kublai Khan's fleet became enshrined in collective memory as irrefutable proof that Japan was a sacred land favored by the gods, a conviction that permeated governance with the shogunate positioning itself as the earthly instrument of heavenly will, rewarding faithful retainers with domains that entrenched the daimyo system of decentralized feudal loyalty, while the imperial line, though symbolically central as descendants of Amaterasu, accepted a ceremonial role that preserved its spiritual prestige without political power, a delicate balance that prevented the kind of centralized absolutism seen in China and allowed regional diversity to flourish under warrior rule. This victory fostered a warrior ethos that elevated Bushido from practical battlefield code to philosophical ideal, samurai internalizing values of absolute loyalty to lord, contempt for death, and constant readiness that were celebrated in tales recited at campfires and formalized in house codes during the subsequent Nanboku-cho Wars and Sengoku Chaos, when warlords like Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin invoked the spirit of Hakata's defenders to rally troops against domestic rivals, the memory of repelling foreign barbarians serving as a unifying myth even amid civil strife. The invasion's failure also had demographic consequences, the loss of so many conscript troops weakening Yuan control over southern China, where rebellions simmered, contributing to the Red Turban movement that toppled Mongol rule and restored native Ming dynasty in 1368, while in Korea, the heavy burden of building ships and providing sailors bred lasting resentment that manifested in piracy and raids on Japanese coasts during the 14th century, complicating relations until Toyotomi Hideyoshi's ill-fated invasions centuries later. In Japan itself, the absence of foreign occupation allowed uninterrupted development of distinctive arts and crafts, lacquerware perfected for samurai armor, swordsmithing reaching its zenith with blades like those of Masamune that became national treasures, tea ceremony evolving under Zen influence as a ritual of mindfulness for warriors contemplating mortality, and garden design reflecting wabi-sabi aesthetics born from appreciation of impermanence, glimpsed in the fleeting glory of battle and the sudden storms that could decide empires. The Kamikaze legend influenced foreign policy profoundly, shoguns viewing overseas contact with suspicion that culminated in the 1630s Sakoku edicts, closing the country to most foreigners, permitting only limited Dutch and Chinese trade at Nagasaki under strict control, a policy that preserved cultural purity at the cost of technological stagnation until Commodore Perry's black ships forced opening in 1853. Yet even then, the memory of divine protection fueled resistance to Western domination during the Meiji Restoration, when samurai-led forces overthrew the shogunate to modernize on Japanese terms. Archaeological exploration of the sunken fleets continues to yield astonishing finds, entire ship hulls preserved in anaerobic mud, with cargo of porcelain, coins, and weapons intact, human remains showing wounds from Japanese arrows, and explosive bombs that reveal the terrifying technology the samurai faced without fear. Each discovery featured in museums that draw millions to contemplate how close the nation came to subjugation. Annual rituals at coastal shrines involve priests reenacting the storms with drums and bells, offerings cast into the sea for drowned souls of both sides in a gesture of reconciliation that acknowledges shared humanity in war, while school curricula teach the invasions as the foundational moment of national resilience, children memorizing poems composed by grateful emperors thanking the winds. The story's global resonance grew with Japan's rise in the modern era, Western historians drawing parallels to their own naval traditions, while the tragic reuse of kamikaze in World War II added bittersweet layers as young pilots embraced the ancient ideal in desperate defense against overwhelming Allied fleets, their sacrifice echoing the original samurai who fought knowing heaven might intervene. Popular media perpetuates the epic, manga series depicting Suenaga's exploits with dynamic panels of boarding actions, films using CGI to recreate the typhoon's fury as ships splinter and warriors cling to wreckage, documentaries diving on wrecks with submersibles narrating the drama in real time, all ensuring the tale remains vivid for audiences worldwide fascinated by the clash of steppe conquerors against island swordsmen. Military academies study the campaigns as masterclasses in asymmetric defense, noting how Japanese mobility and night operations neutralized Yuan advantages in firepower and numbers, lessons applied in later guerrilla conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Tourism thrives along Kyushu's Genko sites, with guided kayak tours over submerged wrecks, reconstructed samurai camps for overnight stays, and panoramic viewpoints where visitors imagine the horizon once black with sails, now peaceful under cherry blossoms. Consider how those 1,000 samurai who stood unwavering at Hakata's bloodied beaches in 1281, their armor battered yet spirits unbroken, as they met 40,000 invaders from the world's supreme empire with katana flashing and arrows singing through humid air for weeks of relentless combat until the divine wind rose in apocalyptic rage to shatter the armada and drown the dream of conquest, did not merely crush the greatest threat Japan would face for centuries, but safeguarded embodied the essence of a civilization that flowered in splendid isolation, nurtured arts and philosophies of transcendent beauty, forged a warrior soul that endured through every trial of history, and inscribed upon the human spirit the immortal truth that when resolute defenders guard their sacred home with every ounce of courage and faith, even the heavens will conspire to sweep tyranny into oblivion, leaving a legacy as boundless as the seas that both carried the invaders to their fate and continue to whisper the eternal song of freedom preserved against all odds. The samurai triumph over the Mongol invasions in 1281 stands as one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of how a relatively small, highly motivated force, leveraging terrain, tactics, and timing, can neutralize overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. For the Japanese defenders, numbering perhaps 10,000 total across Kyushu, but with only around 1,000 elite samurai bearing the brunt of the fiercest fighting at Hakata Bay, exploited the invaders' dependence on their fleet by using swift, shallow-draft boats to conduct hit-and-run raids that prevented secure landings, set ships ablaze with fire arrows, and disrupted supply lines, while the low stone walls they hastily constructed in the years between invasions forced the Mongols into narrow killing zones where massed archery and bomb barrages could be endured long enough for counterattacks to drive them back into the surf, turning the beach into a slaughter pen where individual samurai valor shone brightest in boarding actions that turned enemy decks into chaotic melees, favoring the katana's cutting power over the invaders' shorter swords and spears. This asymmetric defense prefigured later coastal warfare strategies, showing how a determined island nation could make amphibious assault prohibitively costly, a lesson studied by military thinkers from Britain's Royal Navy planners defending against Napoleon to American strategists preparing for potential Japanese invasion in World War II, while the psychological warfare implicit in relentless night raids and refusal to yield ground eroded Mongol morale among conscript troops far from home and unaccustomed to such fanatical resistance. The typhoon itself, though natural and seasonal, struck at the precise moment when weeks of attrition had anchored the fleet in exposed waters, with damaged rigging and exhausted crews unable to sail to safety, transforming what might have been a costly Japanese victory into total annihilation that left no coherent force capable of renewed landing, the wreckage washing ashore for months as grim reminders that the gods had spoken decisively. This combination of human agency and natural catastrophe created a perfect storm, literally, that not only ended Kublai's Japanese ambitions, but altered the trajectory of East Asian history, preventing the cultural and administrative homogenization that Mongol rule imposed on Korea and China, allowing Japan to evolve its feudal system, arts, and spirituality in splendid isolation that produced cultural treasures unmatched elsewhere, from the austere beauty of raked gravel Zen gardens symbolizing impermanence to the intricate perfection of tea ceremony utensils, crafted with the same precision samurai applied to their blades. The victory's memory served as a unifying national myth during periods of internal division, warlords invoking the spirit of Hakata to rally followers with promises of divine protection, while emperors commissioned sutras and shrine reconstructions in gratitude, the blending of Shinto gratitude for kami intervention with Buddhist acceptance of fate, creating a uniquely Japanese worldview that saw human effort and heavenly will as intertwined. When Portuguese traders and Jesuit missionaries arrived in the 16th century, Japanese chroniclers compared them to the Mongol barbarians, their firearms reminiscent of Yuan bombs, reinforcing caution that eventually led to expulsion of Christians and closure of the country, preserving traditional society for another 2 centuries. The invasion's legacy even touched the modern era profoundly, the term kamikaze reborn in 1944 when Vice Admiral Onishi formed special attack units of pilots who embraced the ancient ideal of sacrificial defense, diving their planes into Allied ships in deliberate echo of the divine winds that had saved their ancestors, a tragic but direct lineage from 1281's celebration of preservation to 1945's desperate self-destruction. Contemporary Japan balances pride in the victory with reflection on war's cost, museums displaying both Mongol artifacts and samurai armor side by side to show the shared humanity of warriors on both sides, school trips to Hakata fostering understanding of how close history came to different paths, while international scholars collaborate on underwater archaeology that reveals ever more about the lost fleets. Popular culture keeps the story alive through epic films with sweeping CGI recreations of the typhoon as a roaring vortex of wind and wave, swallowing hundreds of ships in minutes, historical novels exploring the personal dramas of named samurai whose scrolls survive, and strategy games allowing players to command either side with accurate unit stats, reflecting the clash of continental mass versus island agility. Military academies worldwide include the campaigns in curricula on amphibious operations and defense against superior forces, noting how Japanese intelligence from Korean sources allowed anticipation of the dual fleet strategy, how decentralized command enabled rapid response to landings, and how psychological resilience turned potential defeat into legendary triumph. Tourism along the Genko coast thrives with immersive experiences, visitors donning reproduction armor to practice yumi archery on beaches where ancestors fought, diving tours over wrecks guided by sonar maps, and sunset vigils at shrines where lanterns float out to the sea, commemorating all who perished in the storms. Consider ultimately how those 1,000 samurai who held the line at Hakata Bay in 1281 against 40,000 invaders from the world's dominant empire, fighting with transcendent mastery of blade and bow through weeks of fire and blood until the divine wind rose in cataclysmic fury to devour the armada and seal victory forever, did not merely crush the most ambitious conquest in medieval history, but preserved the sacred essence of a nation for nearly 7 centuries of unbroken sovereignty, nurtured a culture of unparalleled beauty and depth, born from confident isolation, forged the unbreakable warrior spirit that defined Japan through every era of trial and transformation, and illuminated for all humanity the eternal verity that when resolute souls defend their home with every fiber of courage, skill, and faith, even the mightiest tyrants and their vast hosts can be humbled by human will allied with the very forces of nature, leaving a legacy as infinite as the oceans that witness the triumph and as radiant as the rising sun that continues to bless the land the gods chose to save.